She was just trying to buy her granddaughter a birthday gift when the mall security officer decided she didn't belong. He shoved her against the wall, called her names that made shoppers stop and stare. But what he didn't know was that the 67-year-old grandmother had been carrying a badge longer than he'd been alive, and she was about to show him what real authority looks like. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass ceiling of Westfield Shopping Center, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. It was a typical Saturday in suburban Maryland, the kind of day when families filled the corridors with laughter and the sound of children's voices echoed off the walls. The air conditioning hummed quietly overhead, mixing with the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, until Dorothy Williams walked into the toy store. Dorothy moved slowly through the aisles, her brown leather purse clutched firmly in her right hand, her eyes scanning the shelves with the focused determination of a grandmother on a mission. At 67, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from decades of commanding respect in rooms where she was often the only woman, often the only black face among a sea of uniforms. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a simple navy cardigan over dark slacks, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of someone who had learned long ago that presence mattered more than presentation. She paused in front of a display of educational toys, her weathered fingers tracing the edge of a colorful chemistry set. 8-year-old Keisha had been talking about becoming a scientist for months now, ever since her school's science fair had sparked something bright and curious in her young mind. Dorothy smiled to herself, remembering how Keisha's eyes had lit up when she'd explained the difference between a hypothesis and a theory, using terms that most adults struggled with. The girl was brilliant, just like her grandmother had been at that age, before the world tried to convince her that certain dreams weren't meant for girls who looked like them. The chemistry set was expensive, $89.99 according to the small white price tag, but Dorothy didn't hesitate. She'd worked 30 years for the Metropolitan Police Department, climbing from patrol officer to sergeant through sheer determination and an unshakable belief that the system could be changed from within. Her pension was modest but sufficient, and if she wanted to spend it on her granddaughter's dreams, that was her business and nobody else's. She lifted the box carefully, testing its weight. It was heavier than she'd expected, packed with beakers and test tubes and little bottles of safe chemicals that would let Keisha explore the world of science without any real danger. Perfect. She tucked it under her arm and continued browsing, looking for something smaller to go with it, maybe a book or a puzzle that would complement the main gift. 20 feet away, near the store's entrance, Marcus Reed watched her with the kind of focused intensity that had gotten him written up twice in his 2 years as a mall security officer. At 28, Reed was still young enough to believe that authority came from the uniform and the badge clipped to his chest, still naive enough to think that suspicion was the same thing as good police work. He'd been hired by Westfield Security Services after washing out of the police academy, a detail he preferred not to discuss with his colleagues or the women he met at bars. In his mind, mall security was just a stepping stone, a place to prove himself before reapplying to the force. Reed's eyes narrowed as he watched Dorothy handle the expensive chemistry set. In his experience, people who dressed down in cheap clothing and carried old purses didn't usually shop for $100 toys. He'd learned to spot the signs, or at least he thought he had. The way she held the box, like she was calculating its value. The way she kept glancing around, checking to see if anyone was watching. The way she seemed to be taking her time, as if she was waiting for the right moment to make her move. He'd caught 3 shoplifters in the past month, all of them teenagers trying to steal video games or makeup, and each successful bust had filled him with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since the academy rejection. The store managers had praised his vigilance, and his supervisor had hinted that a promotion might be possible if he kept up the good work. Reed was hungry for that validation, desperate to prove that he belonged in law enforcement, even if it was just in a shopping mall. Dorothy moved to another aisle, her pace unhurried, her demeanor calm. She was looking at books now, educational titles about space and dinosaurs and the human body. Reed followed at a distance, trying to look casual as he pretended to check his radio and adjust his belt. He'd been trained to observe without being obvious, though his interpretation of subtlety left much to be desired. Other shoppers were beginning to notice him, the way he hovered near the toy store entrance, the way his eyes never left the older black woman who was simply trying to shop for her granddaughter. Inside the store, Dorothy found a book about famous female scientists and added it to her growing collection. Marie Curie smiled up at her from the cover, a reminder that barriers were meant to be broken, that little girls could grow up to change the world if they had the right encouragement and the right tools. She thought about Keisha's questions, the way the girl's mind worked, always asking why and how and what if. It reminded Dorothy of herself at that age, before life had taught her to be careful, before she'd learned that being curious while black and female required a special kind of courage. She'd been one of only 3 women in her police academy class, the only black woman, and she'd graduated second in her class despite the instructors who seemed surprised every time she excelled. 30 years later, she'd trained dozens of rookie officers, had served on community outreach panels, had testified before city council about police reform and community relations. She'd seen the best and worst of law enforcement, had fought battles both within the department and on the streets, and had somehow managed to maintain her faith in the possibility of justice even when justice seemed impossible. Reed's patience was wearing thin. The woman had been in the store for almost 15 minutes now, handling expensive items, taking her time, and she still hadn't approached the register. In his mind, this was classic shoplifting behavior, the kind of pattern they'd taught him to recognize during his brief training. He pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through the department's guidelines, refreshing his memory about detention procedures and probable cause. The words blurred together in his eagerness, but he caught the important parts about suspicious behavior and reasonable suspicion. He didn't notice the store employee who'd been watching him watch Dorothy, didn't see the concerned look on her face as she observed his obvious surveillance. Maria Gonzalez had been working at Learning Express for 3 years, and she'd seen enough overzealous security guards to recognize trouble when it was brewing. She glanced at Dorothy, who was now reading the back of a book about astronomy, completely unaware of the attention she was attracting. "Excuse me," Maria said quietly, approaching Reed from the side. "Is there a problem with that customer?" Reed straightened, his hand automatically moving to his radio. "Just keeping an eye on things," he said, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone trying to sound more important than he actually was. "Standard procedure." Maria frowned. "She's been shopping normally. Hasn't done anything suspicious that I can see." "I'll be the judge of that," Reed replied, dismissing her with a tone that made Maria's jaw tighten. She'd dealt with his type before, men who wore uniforms like armor and treated retail workers like they were invisible. She made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation, to step in if things got out of hand. Dorothy had settled on her purchases, the chemistry set, the book about female scientists, and a small telescope that had caught her eye near the checkout counter. Keisha would love it, she was sure. The girl was always asking about the stars, about whether there was life on other planets, about how far away everything was. Dorothy had tried to answer as best she could, but science had never been her strongest subject. That was what made this gift so perfect. It would let Keisha explore and discover on her own, would give her the tools to find her own answers. She approached the register with her items, setting them down carefully on the counter. The total came to $127.43, well within her budget for Keisha's birthday. She reached into her purse for her wallet, taking her time to find the exact bills. Her hands moved slowly, not from age or infirmity, but from the deliberate care of someone who had learned to make every movement count, every gesture intentional. That's when Reed made his move. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stepping up behind her with the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately changed the energy in the store. "I need to see your receipt for those items." Dorothy turned slowly, her eyebrows raised in polite confusion. "I haven't paid for them yet," she said calmly. "I'm checking out now." Reed's face flushed slightly, but he didn't back down. "I've been watching you handle merchandise for the past 20 minutes. That's suspicious behavior. I need to verify that you haven't concealed anything else." The store went quiet. Other customers turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they registered the confrontation unfolding at the checkout counter. Maria stepped closer, her hand hovering near the phone, ready to call her manager if things escalated. The teenage cashier looked back and forth between Dorothy and Reed, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Dorothy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening of her shoulders that spoke of decades spent dealing with men who mistook aggression for authority. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from training and experience, "I'm simply purchasing gifts for my granddaughter. There's nothing suspicious about shopping." "That's for me to determine," Reed shot back, his hand moving to rest on his radio. "Now, I'm going to need you to step aside so I can verify that you haven't taken anything." The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, taking in his posture, his tone, the way his eyes kept darting around the store as if he was performing for an audience. She'd seen this before, too many times to count. Young men with badges and attitudes, convinced that authority meant never backing down, never admitting mistake, never showing anything that might be perceived as weakness. "On what grounds?" she asked quietly. Reed's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected pushback, hadn't prepared for someone who knew enough to ask the right questions. "Suspicious behavior," he repeated, louder this time. "Loitering, handling expensive merchandise, checking to see if anyone was watching." "I was shopping," Dorothy said simply. "The same thing every other customer in this store is doing." "Not like that, you weren't." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, other shoppers began to murmur, some pulling out phones, others stepping closer to get a better view. Maria had already picked up the store phone and was quietly calling for backup, speaking in rapid Spanish to someone on the other end. Dorothy felt the familiar weight of being watched, judged, found guilty of something she hadn't done simply because of who she was and what she looked like. It was a feeling she'd thought she'd left behind when she retired from the force, when she'd finally earned the right to move through the world without constantly proving her right to exist in it. But here it was again, in a toy store on a Saturday afternoon, delivered by a young man who'd probably never spent a day in her shoes. She reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, and Reed's hand immediately moved to his belt, his entire body tensing as if she might be reaching for a weapon. Instead, she pulled out her credit card and placed it on the counter next to her purchases. "I'm paying for my items," she said calmly. "If you have specific allegations to make, I suggest you make them clearly. If not, I suggest you let me complete my transaction and go home to my granddaughter." Reed's face grew redder. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. Most people, when confronted by security, either ran or immediately became defensive and argumentative, giving him clear justification for whatever action he chose to take. This woman's calm was throwing him off, making him feel like he was the one being evaluated and found wanting. "Ma'am, you need to cooperate with security," he said, his voice rising. "I have reasonable suspicion that you've concealed merchandise, and I have the authority to detain you for investigation." Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "Do you now?" she asked, and something in her tone made the teenager behind the register take a step back. The confrontation was escalating, drawing more attention with each passing second. Shoppers had formed a loose circle around the checkout area, some recording with their phones, others simply watching with the morbid fascination that comes with witnessing someone else's humiliation. But Dorothy Williams was not someone who humiliated easily, and Marcus Reed was about to learn exactly what he was dealing with. If you want to see what happens when this security guard realizes he's picked the wrong grandmother to mess with, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss the moment when she shows him what real authority looks like. And drop a comment, have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power like this? Because what happens next is going to change everything. The tension in the toy store was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Dorothy Williams was just getting started. The standoff at the checkout counter stretched on for what felt like hours but was really only seconds. Dorothy Williams stood perfectly still, her credit card gleaming on the counter like a challenge, her dark eyes fixed on Marcus Reed's flushed face. Around them, the toy store had transformed from a place of childhood wonder into something that felt more like a courtroom, with shoppers serving as an unwilling jury and smartphones acting as court reporters. Reed's training, what little of it there had been, told him to de-escalate situations like this. His supervisor had been clear about avoiding confrontations that could end up on social media, about the importance of maintaining the mall's family-friendly reputation. But his ego, bruised by Dorothy's calm defiance, was screaming something entirely different. He couldn't back down now, not with all these people watching, not when his authority was being questioned by someone who was supposed to be intimidated by his uniform. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of someone reciting policy they didn't fully understand, "I'm going to need you to step away from the register and accompany me to the security office for questioning." Dorothy didn't move. "On what specific charges?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from asking the same question in actual courtrooms, in front of actual judges, during actual criminal proceedings. Reed blinked. Most people didn't ask about specific charges. Most people either complied immediately or started yelling, giving him clear justification for whatever came next. This woman's knowledge of proper procedure was unsettling, like she'd been through this before from the other side. "Suspected shoplifting," he said finally, the words coming out more defensive than authoritative. "Based on what evidence?" Dorothy pressed. "Based on your behavior," Reed shot back, his voice rising. "Loitering, handling expensive merchandise, acting suspicious." "I was shopping," Dorothy repeated, her tone never changing. "In a store. During business hours. With money to pay for my purchases." Behind the register, the teenage cashier, her name tag read Ashley, looked back and forth between them like she was watching a tennis match. She'd worked retail for 2 years, had seen her share of difficult customers and overzealous security guards, but this felt different. The older woman wasn't acting like someone with something to hide. She was acting like someone who knew exactly what her rights were and wasn't afraid to exercise them. Maria Gonzalez appeared at Ashley's shoulder, having finished her hushed phone call to management. "The store manager is on his way," she whispered, but her voice carried in the tense silence. Reed shot her an annoyed look, as if her presence was somehow undermining his authority. "This doesn't concern store personnel," he said sharply. "This is a security matter." "Actually," Maria replied, crossing her arms, "when it happens in our store, it very much concerns us. And I've been watching this whole interaction. This customer hasn't done anything wrong." Reed's face grew redder. Now he had 2 women questioning his judgment, 2 women who didn't seem to understand that when security said jump, you were supposed to ask how high. His hand moved to his radio again, a gesture that was becoming more frequent as his confidence wavered. "I don't need store employees telling me how to do my job," he snapped. "If you interfere with this investigation, I'll have you removed from the premises." Maria's eyebrows shot up. "You'll have me removed? From the store where I work?" The absurdity of the threat hung in the air, and several shoppers actually laughed. Reed's authority was crumbling in real time, undermined by his own overreach and the quiet dignity of the woman he was trying to intimidate. But instead of backing down, instead of recognizing that he was in over his head, he doubled down. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Dorothy, "I'm not going to ask again. You need to come with me now, or I'll call for backup." Dorothy tilted her head slightly, studying him with the kind of professional assessment that made Reed squirm. She'd seen his type before, during her 30 years on the force. Young officers who confused aggression with strength, who thought that raising their voice was the same as commanding respect. They usually washed out within the first year, either because they couldn't handle the actual demands of police work or because their attitudes got them into trouble they couldn't talk their way out of. "Call for backup," she said simply. Reed blinked again. That wasn't the response he'd expected. People who were guilty of something didn't usually invite more scrutiny. People who had something to hide didn't typically encourage the arrival of additional authorities. For a moment, his certainty wavered, and he found himself wondering if he'd misread the situation entirely. But only for a moment. Pride is a powerful thing, especially wounded pride, and Marcus Reed had invested too much of himself in this confrontation to walk away now. He grabbed his radio and keyed the mic, his voice carrying the artificial urgency of someone trying to justify their actions after the fact. "Security to Unit 2, I need backup at Learning Express, suspicious individual refusing to comply with detention. The radio crackled back immediately. Unit 2 to security, what's the nature of the incident? Reed hesitated. How do you explain that you're detaining a grandmother for the crime of shopping while black? How do you articulate suspicions that are based more on prejudice than evidence? How do you admit that you've escalated a simple misunderstanding into a public confrontation because your ego couldn't handle being questioned? Possible shoplifting suspect, he said finally. Individual is being uncooperative and refusing to submit to search. The lie hung in the air, obvious to everyone who had witnessed the actual interaction. Dorothy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not fear, not anger, but a kind of weary recognition. She'd heard these lies before, had seen how quickly facts could be twisted to fit a predetermined narrative. Around them, the crowd of shoppers had grown larger. Word was spreading through the mall that something was happening at the toy store, and people were drifting over to see what the commotion was about. Teenagers with phones, mothers with strollers, elderly couples who had stopped their window shopping to witness whatever drama was unfolding. Ashley the cashier looked increasingly uncomfortable. She'd processed thousands of transactions during her time at the store, had learned to read customers pretty well, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The older woman had been polite, had asked questions about the educational toys, had clearly intended to pay for everything. There was nothing suspicious about her behavior except for the fact that a security guard had decided there was. "Ma'am," Ashley said quietly, "would you like me to process your payment while we wait for the manager?" It was a simple question, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Because if Dorothy was really a shoplifter, if she really had stolen merchandise or was trying to scam the store, why would she still be trying to pay for her items? Reed whirled around. "Don't process anything," he barked. "This woman is being detained pending investigation." "On what authority?" Dorothy asked, and for the first time, there was steel in her voice. Reed's hand moved to his belt, to the handcuffs that mall security officers weren't supposed to use without direct approval from law enforcement. "On the authority of this badge," he said, tapping the plastic security badge pinned to his shirt. Dorothy almost smiled. Almost. Because if this young man thought that piece of plastic gave him the authority to detain law-abiding citizens, he was about to get a very expensive education in the difference between real law enforcement and mall security theater. "That badge," she said quietly, "doesn't give you the authority you think it does." Reed's jaw clenched. "We'll see about that." The backup he'd called for arrived in the form of James Morrison, a 15-year veteran of mall security who had seen enough false alarms and rookie mistakes to recognize both from a distance. Morrison was older, calmer, and possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that came from years of dealing with actual problems rather than manufactured ones. He took one look at the scene, the dignified older woman, the flustered Reed, the crowd of concerned shoppers, and immediately understood that his younger colleague had stepped in something he couldn't handle. "What's the situation?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Reed launched into his explanation, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to justify his actions. Suspicious individual, possible concealment, refusing to comply with investigation, hostile attitude toward security personnel. Morrison looked at Dorothy, taking in her calm demeanor, her modest but neat clothing, the chemistry set and books still sitting on the counter. "Ma'am, are you trying to purchase those items?" "I am," Dorothy replied. "Or I was, before your colleague decided I was suspicious for shopping while black." The words hung in the air like an accusation, which they were. Reed's face went purple. "That's not, I never said anything about, this has nothing to do with race." Morrison sighed. He'd heard that protest before, usually right before someone filed a complaint that ended up on his supervisor's desk. "What specifically did you observe that led you to suspect this customer of shoplifting?" Reed's explanation became less coherent the second time around, full of vague references to suspicious behavior and standard protocols that sounded increasingly hollow when subjected to scrutiny. Morrison listened with the patience of someone who had to clean up messes like this on a regular basis. "Ma'am," Morrison said when Reed finished, "I apologize for the confusion. Would you like to complete your purchase? It should have been the end of it. A simple de-escalation, an apology, a return to normal operations. Dorothy could have paid for her items, left the store, and gone home to wrap birthday presents for her granddaughter. The story could have ended there, with no viral videos, no career consequences, no lessons learned the hard way. But Marcus Reed's pride wouldn't let it end there. No, he said, stepping between Morrison and Dorothy. I initiated this investigation, and I'm going to see it through. This woman has been uncooperative from the beginning, and I have reasonable suspicion to detain her. Morrison's expression hardened. Reed, stand down. I'm not standing down, Reed shot back. She's trying to make this about race, trying to play the victim, but I know what I saw. She was acting suspicious, and I have every right to investigate. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, reading the combination of fear and anger and wounded pride that was driving his increasingly erratic behavior. She'd seen it before, in young officers who couldn't admit they'd made a mistake, who would rather compound their errors than acknowledge their humanity. Officer Reed, she said quietly, you're making this much worse than it needs to be. Don't tell me how to do my job, Reed snapped, and then he made the mistake that would change everything. He grabbed her arm. Not roughly, not violently, but firmly enough to establish physical control, to demonstrate that his authority was backed by force. It was a calculated gesture, designed to show everyone watching that he was in charge, that he wouldn't be intimidated by calm questions or reasonable objections. Dorothy looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the crowd had to strain to hear her. Take your hand off me. Reed's grip tightened. You're coming with me. No, Dorothy said simply. I'm not. And that's when everything went wrong. Reed, frustrated by her continued defiance, by the crowd of witnesses, by his fellow security officers' obvious disapproval, by his complete loss of control over the situation, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He pulled. Dorothy, despite her age, despite her calm demeanor, despite 30 years of experience in knowing when to fight and when to wait, wasn't going to be manhandled by a mall security guard having a power trip. She planted her feet and resisted, her voice carrying clearly through the store. You do not have the authority to physically detain me, she said. And if you don't remove your hands immediately, you're going to regret it. Reed's response was to tighten his grip and pull harder, trying to force her toward the store exit. The crowd gasped, phones came up, and Maria Gonzalez immediately started dialing 911. But Dorothy Williams had spent 3 decades learning how to handle men who confused badges with permission to abuse their power. And Marcus Reed was about to discover exactly what happened when you put your hands on the wrong grandmother. The chemistry set sat forgotten on the counter, Keisha's birthday gift waiting to be purchased, while her grandmother prepared to teach a lesson that wouldn't be found in any textbook. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen, that they were about to witness the kind of moment that changes everything. Dorothy's purse was still in her free hand, and Reed still had no idea what was inside it. He was focused on asserting his authority, on proving his point, on winning a confrontation that he should have walked away from 10 minutes earlier. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and Marcus Reed was about to get an education in the difference between real authority and the cheap imitation he'd been carrying around on his belt. The moment stretched taut, balanced on the edge of something that couldn't be taken back. And in that tension, with a crowd of witnesses and the weight of 30 years of service behind her, Dorothy Williams made her choice. The moment Marcus Reed's hand tightened on Dorothy Williams' arm, something shifted in the air of the toy store. It wasn't just the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd, or the way Morrison stepped forward with alarm written across his face. It was something deeper, more fundamental, the sound of a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Dorothy looked down at Reed's grip on her arm, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the store go silent. Officer Reed, she said, you have exactly 3 seconds to remove your hand from my arm, or I'm going to show you what happens when you assault a law enforcement officer. Reed's grip loosened slightly, confusion flickering across his features. What did you say? You heard me, Dorothy replied, reaching into her purse with her free hand. 3, 2. Ma'am, don't reach for anything, Reed warned, his other hand moving toward his belt, but Dorothy's movement was slow, deliberate, unthreatening. She pulled out a black leather wallet, the kind that had seen decades of use, worn smooth at the edges from being carried every day for 30 years. 1, she said quietly, and opened the wallet. The gold badge caught the overhead lights and threw them back like a mirror. Metropolitan Police Department, it read in bold letters around the edges, with a sergeant's stripes clearly visible beneath the shield. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording, everyone trying to get a better look at what had just changed everything. Reed's hand dropped from Dorothy's arm like he'd been burned. His face went through a progression of colors, red to white to pale green, as the full weight of what he'd just done settled over him. Sergeant Dorothy Williams, she said calmly, holding the badge so everyone could see it clearly. 30 years with Metro PD, retired last year, but the badge doesn't expire. She looked directly at Reed, her voice taking on the tone she'd used during 3 decades of dealing with rookie officers who'd overstepped their bounds. And you just physically detained a police officer without cause. The store erupted. Shoppers who had been filming gasped and started talking all at once. Ashley the cashier's mouth fell open. Maria Gonzalez crossed her arms and gave Reed a look that could have melted steel. Even Morrison took a step back, suddenly understanding that this situation had just escalated far beyond anything mall security was equipped to handle. Reed stammered, his composure completely shattered. I didn't know, you didn't say. I shouldn't have to say, Dorothy replied, closing the wallet but keeping it visible. A law-abiding citizen shopping in a store shouldn't need police credentials to avoid harassment. But since you forced the issue. She let the sentence hang in the air. Morrison immediately stepped between them, damage control written all over his face. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Officer Reed is new, and clearly made an error in judgment. An error in judgment? Dorothy's eyebrows rose. He physically grabbed me without probable cause, lied on his radio about my behavior, and ignored direct orders from his supervisor. In my book, that's not an error, that's a pattern of misconduct. Reed found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. I was just doing my job. She was acting suspicious, handling expensive merchandise. I was shopping, Dorothy said simply. Something I've done hundreds of times without being accosted by security. The only thing different about today was that you decided to see a threat where none existed. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion and the spreading word that something incredible was happening in the toy store. Teenagers were already posting clips to social media, their phones capturing every word of the confrontation. #mall security fail was about to start trending. Ashley finally found her courage. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams, would you like me to process your payment now? Dorothy smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. That would be lovely, thank you. She placed her credit card on the counter, and Ashley quickly rang up the chemistry set, the book about female scientists, and the small telescope. The transaction that should have taken 2 minutes 30 minutes ago was finally completed, while Reed stood frozen in place, watching his career implode in real time. Will there be anything else? Ashley asked, her voice carefully professional despite the chaos surrounding them. Just a receipt, Dorothy replied. I want documentation of this purchase, since Officer Reed seems so concerned about my ability to pay for things. Reed's face flushed again. Sergeant Williams, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, studying his face with the kind of professional assessment that had served her well during 3 decades of police work. Officer Reed, she said finally, do you know why I became a police officer? Reed shook his head, afraid to speak. Because I wanted to serve my community. I wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I wanted to be part of the solution to problems like prejudice and abuse of power. She paused, letting the words sink in. 30 years later, standing in this toy store, watching you abuse your authority to harass an innocent woman, I have to wonder if anything I did made a difference." The weight of her disappointment was somehow worse than anger would have been. Reed felt it settle on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. Morrison cleared his throat. "Sergeant Williams, is there anything we can do to make this right?" Dorothy considered the question while she waited for Ashley to finish processing her payment. Around them, the crowd continued to film and whisper, documenting every moment of Reed's humiliation. But Dorothy wasn't interested in humiliation, she was interested in accountability. "You can start by reviewing your training procedures," she said. "Because if Officer Reed is representative of your security staff, you have serious problems. You can also review the footage from your security cameras and his body cam, if he was wearing one, to see exactly how this situation escalated." Reed's hand moved involuntarily to his chest, where a small camera was indeed clipped to his uniform. He'd forgotten about it entirely during the confrontation, too focused on asserting his authority to remember that everything was being recorded. "The footage will show," Dorothy continued, "that I was polite, cooperative, and lawful throughout this entire encounter. It will also show that Officer Reed escalated the situation at every opportunity, ignored de-escalation techniques, and ultimately used physical force against someone who posed no threat to anyone." She accepted her receipt from Ashley and carefully placed it in her purse, along with her police badge. "In my experience, officers who behave this way towards someone they perceive as powerless tend to behave even worse when they think no one is watching." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Reed's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting, that this wasn't an isolated incident, that his behavior patterns were being questioned, that his entire career was about to be scrutinized. Morrison's phone was already buzzing with calls from mall management. Word was spreading through the building about what had happened, and everyone wanted to know how one of their security officers had managed to create a public relations nightmare by harassing a retired police sergeant. But the real story, the one that would matter long after the viral videos stopped circulating, was still unfolding. Because Dorothy Williams wasn't done teaching lessons, and Marcus Reed was about to learn that accountability doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. If you're watching this and thinking about how quickly things can change when someone reveals who they really are, make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from over. Dorothy isn't just going to walk away, and Reed's problems are just getting started. Drop a comment and let me know, what do you think should happen to a security guard who clearly abuses his power? Because what happens next is going to shock you. The chemistry set was finally paid for, but the real education was just beginning. The mall's head of security arrived within minutes, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. David Chen had been in loss prevention for 15 years, and he could spot a career-ending incident from across a food court. The crowd of phone-wielding witnesses, the viral video already spreading, and the retired police sergeant standing calmly in the center of it all told him everything he needed to know. "Sergeant Williams," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Chen, head of security. I want to personally apologize for this incident." Dorothy shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Chen, I assume you'll be conducting a full investigation?" "Absolutely. Officer Reed is suspended immediately pending review. This behavior is completely unacceptable and doesn't represent our values." Reed's face went white. "Suspended? But I was just..." "You were just what?" Chen cut him off. "Harassing a customer? Lying on your radio? Physically detaining someone without cause?" He turned to Morrison. "Get him off the floor. Now." As Reed was escorted away, his protests echoing through the store, Dorothy gathered her purchases. The chemistry set, the book about female scientists, the telescope, all the gifts that had started this entire confrontation. Keisha would love them, and someday, when she was older, Dorothy would tell her the story of the day Grandma had to remind someone what real authority looked like. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached Dorothy to thank her. An elderly black man shook her hand and said simply, "Thank you for not backing down." A young mother with her teenage son whispered, "He needed to see this. To see someone stand up." Maria Gonzalez walked over as Dorothy prepared to leave. "Sergeant Williams, I just want you to know, what you did today, standing your ground like that, it matters. We see stuff like this all the time, but nobody ever speaks up. Dorothy smiled. 30 years of police work teaches you when to fight and when to wait. Today was a day to fight. 3 days later, the security camera footage and body cam video were released to the media. The mall's investigation concluded that Reed had violated multiple policies: improper detention, racial profiling, failure to de-escalate, and filing a false report. He was terminated immediately and banned from working security at any Westfield property. The viral video reached 3 million views within a week. Dorothy received interview requests from national news outlets, speaking engagement invitations, and hundreds of messages from people sharing their own experiences with security harassment. She accepted a few interviews, always steering the conversation towards systemic issues rather than personal vindication. "This isn't about me," she told CNN. "It's about how many people this happens to who don't have a badge to pull out. Who don't have 30 years of authority to fall back on. Those are the people we should be thinking about." Reed, meanwhile, struggled to find new employment. His termination had made local news, and the video followed him wherever he applied. He eventually left the area, moving back in with his parents in Ohio, his law enforcement dreams permanently shattered. 6 months later, Dorothy was invited to speak at the mall's new diversity and inclusion training program. She stood in the same conference room where Reed had once been told he had potential, addressing a group of new security officers about respect, dignity, and the difference between authority and power. Real authority, she told them, comes from serving others, not controlling them. It comes from protecting the vulnerable, not preying on them. And it's earned through decades of doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. After the training, she stopped by Learning Express. Ashley, still working the register, lit up when she saw her. "Sergeant Williams. How's your granddaughter?" Dorothy smiled, pulling out her phone to show a picture of Keisha in a lab coat, surrounded by beakers and test tubes from the chemistry set. "She's going to change the world," Dorothy said. "One experiment at a time." The toy store looked exactly the same, but something fundamental had changed. The new security protocols were posted by the entrance, and the staff had been trained to recognize harassment before it escalated. It wasn't perfect, no system ever was, but it was better. Dorothy picked up a new book for Keisha, something about space exploration and the women who made it possible. As she paid for it, she thought about the day that had started with simple shopping and ended with a lesson that reached millions of people. Sometimes justice comes in small moments. Sometimes it takes 30 years of service to earn the authority to demand respect. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to back down when someone tries to make you smaller than you are. Reed had learned that authority without wisdom is just bullying with a badge. Dorothy had reminded the world that real power comes from knowing who you are and standing firm in that knowledge, no matter who tries to tell you otherwise. The chemistry set had been worth every penny, but the lesson it led to was priceless. If this story of standing up to injustice inspired you, subscribe for more incredible stories where karma catches up to people who abuse their power. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when someone gets exactly what they deserve. And tell me in the comments, what did you think of Dorothy's response? Should more people with experience step up like this when they witness discrimination? Your stories might be featured in our next video. Thanks for watching, and remember, respect is earned, not demanded. Real authority comes from service, not intimidation. And sometimes, the quiet grandmother shopping for birthday gifts is exactly the person who needs to remind us what justice looks like. See you next time, and keep standing up for what's right.